Welcome to the Feminist Park Podcast. I'm Kwame.
And I'm Leilani. It's great to be kicking off this journey with you all today.
Yeah, we're diving into work that's really closely tied to the vision behind the Feminist Park Project, which was founded by Susanne.
That project's goal is pretty ambitious, isn't it? Imagining these truly equitable public spaces, starting with the idea for an intersectional feminist park right here in Berlin.
Exactly. And this podcast, well, it's kind of an extension of that. We're going to be digging into the academic research that, supports and informs that kind of vision.
We'll be taking these dense, sometimes quite academic papers and really pulling out the core and insights.
And looking at them through specific lenses, things like environmental justice, intersectionality, anti-colonial thought, queer theory.
All the stuff that helps us think critically about space.
So for our first deep dive, we're actually starting with some background research that Hussein came across early on. And it highlighted something, well, frankly, quite jarring. That the benefits we think we all get from urban green spaces, parks and squares and things like physical and mental well-being, they're often deeply gendered.
Meaning women and also gender-diverse people, they just don't get the same access or experience those benefits in the same way men do.
Right. Less equitable access, fewer benefits. It seems almost counterintuitive, doesn't it? A park is just a park, open to everyone. So today, we're doing a deep dive into something really foundational, something that shapes so much of our lives, but often goes unseen. Capitalism. But maybe not capitalism as you typically think about it. We're looking at it through a really specific lens, a revealing one. The feminist critique.
Yeah, and it's fascinating, isn't it? Because usually we talk about capitalism in terms of like markets, growth, GDP, that kind of thing. But this perspective, it really challenges us. It makes us look beyond those standard metrics, makes us think about how power and gender and social relations, how they're all deeply woven into the very fabric of capitalism. It's about spotting those hidden structures, you know? The ones influencing everything. Our work, our personal lives, even, our relationship with the environment.
Right. So our mission today is to unpack a pretty foundational German academic text. It's called Feministische Kapitalismuskritik, Einstieg in bedeutende Forschungsfelder, which translates roughly to Feminist Critique of Capitalism, an introduction to important research fields. And this isn't just going to be a quick overview. We want this to be a real exploration, getting into the different viewpoints, sometimes conflicting ones, within these feminist critiques, helping you connect these, well, sometimes quite complex theoretical ideas to what actually happens in the real world, how it impacts your life.
And that raises a really important question, I think. How do we actually understand, let alone challenge, these big systems when their very design can make certain groups, certain experiences kind of invisible or subordinate? So this deep dive should hopefully illuminate some of those core arguments and show why these critiques are just so essential for getting a fuller picture of our society, moving beyond just the standard economic analysis, to really grasp the human and social dimensions of it all.
Okay, and the source we're digging into, it's a 2015 publication by Brigitte Aulenbacher, Birgit, Riegraf, and Susanne Völker. And it also includes a really compelling interview with Ariel Selle. It's part of this German series called Einstieg, which tackles fundamental concepts in social philosophy and theory. So it's quite comprehensive.
Right. So what does this actually mean for you listening in? Well, we'll be navigating through a whole range of arguments. Pretty rich stuff. We'll look at how capitalism fundamentally structures our lives. We'll talk about the value or lack thereof given to care work, which is often overlooked. We'll touch on ecofeminism, which brings in the environmental angle, and the really pervasive nature of social inequalities. So it's a journey into understanding not just what capitalism is, maybe in textbook terms, but how it shapes our existence, often in profoundly gendered ways and, frankly, often unequal ways. You should gain some insights into how these academic ideas are not abstract at all. They actually offer really critical tools for analyzing and maybe even thinking about transforming the world around us, getting a handle on those hidden forces.
Okay, let's unpack this first big idea then. The source jumps right in with something quite provocative. It says capitalism isn't just an economic system, it's a system of domination, one that actively subordinates life. That really shifts the perspective, doesn't it?
It absolutely does, yeah. What's particularly insightful, I think, is the argument that this isn't separate from other power structures. The authors argue that the very fabric of capitalism is interwoven with patriarchal and colonial structures. This is an interesting metaphor, an archaeology of modern Europe, to sort of explain how capitalism, right from its earliest stages, systematically excluded or undervalued certain kinds of labor, certain forms of life, particularly those traditionally associated with women or, marginalized groups. And the key point is this wasn't just an accident or an oversight. It was, according to this view, a built-in feature, something that shaped societal norms, power dynamics right from the get-go in modern Europe. And this historical view is really crucial because it suggests the inequalities we see today, they aren't just unfortunate byproducts. They might actually be foundational elements of how capitalism developed, deeply embedded in its DNA.
And the source makes this distinction I found important between formal subordination and real subordination. Could you elaborate on that? Because it feels like it gets to the heart of how capitalism impacts us beyond just, the paycheck.
Yes, absolutely. It's a key distinction. So formal subordination, as the text describes it, refers to the more overt, recognizable forms of control within capitalism. The classic example is wage labor. You enter an employment contract, follow established rules, work set hours for a salary. It's formalized. That's what we usually think of as being in the system. But real subordination, well, that goes much, much deeper. It describes a process where the very fabric of life itself, life in its broadest sense, becomes subjected to the logic and the demands of capitalism. So it's not just about your job. It's about how capitalist logic seeps into and structures everything else. Personal relationships, community life, even our relationship with our own bodies, with nature. And often it does this invisibly.
Can you give an example of that? Real subordination.
Sure. Think about the pressure, maybe unspoken, to constantly optimize yourself, your health, your fitness, maybe even your online profile, often based on market trends or what seems productive, or the expectation that you're always available, always on call for work, even when you're technically off the clock. That's real subordination creeping into personal time, personal life. It means that activities that seem outside the direct economy are still shaped by and ultimately serve capitalist accumulation. It's about how the whole process of living, everything needed for human existence to just continue, gets subtly, or sometimes not so subtly, bent towards the demands of the market.
Wow. Okay. So it's not just about labor in that narrow sense. It's also about how categories like gender, class, and what the source terms race, how they are fundamentally intertwined within these power structures. You said interwoven. So it's not just different oppressions running side by side.
Exactly. That's a critical clarification the source makes.
Okay.
It really emphasizes that these categories, gender, class, race, they aren't independent things that just add up. Instead, they are structurally integrated into how capitalism was formed and how it continues to function. They mutually constitute each other.
Mutually constitute, meaning they shape each other.
Precisely. For instance, if you look at the historical development of capitalism, especially in Europe, you can't really understand it without seeing how specific gender arrangements, like the separation of spheres, who does what work, and how colonial practices, the exploitation of resources and people elsewhere, and how racial hierarchies, how all these were instrumental in creating the system that relies on exploiting and devaluing certain groups and their labor. So if you want to address capitalist domination, according to this critique, you have to understand how these different forms of power interlock, how they reinforce each other, creating these really complex interwoven systems of exploitation and privilege. It's about recognizing that, say, the experience of a woman of color in the workforce isn't just about her gender plus her race. It's about the unique combined impact of sexism and racism hitting her simultaneously because they're structured together within the system.
And this connects to a concept I found really compelling in the text, Lebenssorge, which translates, you said, to care for life or livelihood. This seems like where the theory really hits home, connecting directly to our daily lives, caring for ourselves, families, communities. And the source argues this essential part of being human, reproducing life itself, is systematically devalued or externalized by capitalism.
Yes, Lebenssorge is absolutely central to this feminist critique. It highlights what seems like a fundamental contradiction in capitalism. On one hand, the reproduction of life-maintaining human beings, sustaining society, is completely necessary for any economic activity to even happen. You need people. But on the other hand, capitalism consistently undervalues this work. It often pushes these essential functions outside the realm of formal economic recognition, outside of compensation.
Like unpaid housework, childcare.
Exactly. Think about the massive amount of unpaid work involved in raising kids, cooking, cleaning, caring for elderly relatives, providing emotional support. All of that is part of Lebenssorge. It directly contributes to human well-being, to the social fabric that supports a functioning workforce. Yet, traditional capitalist economics tends to prioritize activities that generate profit, abstract production. It often ignores or externalizes the costs of this social reproduction work, treats it like a free resource that will just always be there. And this creates this persistent tension. The system relies heavily on leaven storage, but it refuses to adequately value or support it, which creates huge vulnerabilities and pressures, especially for women who still disproportionately perform this work globally.
Okay, so this isn't an entirely new critique then. The source mentions it has historical roots. Where does this line of thinking about reproduction actually come from?
That's right, it's not new. It has deep historical roots. And stepping back, you can see how this connects to contemporary issues, even things like urban life, which the source touches on later. The text points back to critical sociological debates, particularly from the 1970s and 80s. That's when feminist scholars really started to deeply question how reproduction works within capitalism. And not just biological reproduction, but social and cultural reproduction too, how society itself is maintained. So the concept of social reproduction became a central point of feminist critique. The argument being that reproducing the workforce, reproducing society, it's an absolute prerequisite for capitalist production, yet it often remains unpaid, unrecognized, undervalued. So this historical context is vital. It shows these concerns aren't just recent, they're part of an ongoing critical tradition that's been evolving for decades.
And the source specifically mentions Silvia Federici's work here, particularly her analysis connecting primitive accumulation to the witch hunts in Europe. That sounds like a really powerful historical anchor for understanding how gendered subordination isn't just some modern oversight, but has deep roots in how capitalism even got started. What does she argue specifically?
Federici's work, yes, it provides a really compelling historical lens. She argues that primitive accumulation, that historical process in early modern Europe where common lands were enclosed, resources were privatized, traditional ways of life were destroyed, that wasn't just an economic event, it was profoundly gendered. She directly links the European witch hunts, mainly in the 16th and 17th centuries, to the disciplining of women's bodies, and to the devaluation of their reproductive labor, both biological and social. In her view, controlling women's bodies, controlling their reproductive capacities, was essential for capitalism to rise.
How so? What was the connection?
Well, it helped facilitate the shift away from subsistence economies, where communities often shared resources and women maybe had more autonomy over their bodies and work, towards a system based on wage labor and market production, where women's reproductive work, raising the next generation of workers, maintaining the household, was increasingly confined to the private sphere, unpaid and devalued, seen as non-work. So this historical analysis suggests gendered subordination is baked into the origins of capitalism. It shaped the very categories we still use today, like what counts as productive labor versus reproductive labor. And this prompts a really critical question the source implies. How have these historical processes of dispossession, not just of land, but maybe of communal knowledge, of autonomy, of the value placed on care, how have they continued to shape inequalities today, affecting social relations, what we even consider valuable?
The source also talks about the politics of reproduction being central to challenging capitalist accumulation. What does that mean in practical terms, say, for us today? What does that look like?
The politics of reproduction refers to the ongoing struggles, the contestations over how all these activities that sustain life get organized, valued, and distributed. Think child rearing, elder care, housework, emotional labor, community support, all that lemon sort of stuff. In practical terms today, it means recognizing these activities aren't just private individual chores. They are collective societal concerns, and their undervaluation. It basically serves capitalist accumulation by providing this hidden subsidy to the formal economy. So the politics of reproduction shows up in demands for things like affordable, high-quality public child care, universal elder care, paid parental leave, fair wages and conditions for care workers.
So pushing back against the idea that it's just a family matter.
Exactly. It's about challenging the notion that care is primarily an individual burden, usually falling on women, and instead advocating for policies and social changes that redistribute the burdens and benefits of care more fairly, ensuring proper compensation for care work, directly confronting the system's carelessness, bringing this essential work out of the shadows and into the realm of political and economic demands for change.
And the source mentions there's a controversy or debate within these feminist critiques themselves about how different theories, maybe like Foucault's ideas versus critical theory, approach power and domination in capitalism. So it's not one single unified view.
Not at all. That internal controversy is important. It shows the field is dynamic and evolving. For instance, the text hints at debates between approaches rooted in, say, critical theory. These often focus on large-scale structures, economic exploitation, the systemic power of capital over labor. viewing capitalism as fundamentally unjust in its very design, focusing on that economic base dictating social relations. Then you have perspectives influenced more by thinkers like Foucault. They might still critique power, absolutely, but they might emphasize the micropolitics more, how power operates through discourse, through knowledge, through the subtle ways we're constructed as subjects, not just through brute economic force.
So like how workplace rules or language shape us.
Precisely. A Foucauldian lens might look at how seemingly neutral language or rules subtly discipline our bodies, shape our identities, limit our perceived choices, even when we feel like we're acting freely. Both approaches expose power, but they might look in different places and use different analytical tools. Understanding this internal debate is crucial because it encourages critical engagement, Rather than just accepting one simple story, it shows there are multiple valid ways to analyze these complex systems, each offering valuable insights.
Okay, let's dive deeper into one aspect that seems absolutely central: care work. The source talks about the carelessness of capitalism. How does that actually manifest in the world around us? How might you, our listener, experience that?
Right, this concept of carelessness is vital. It's about how capitalism, because it's fundamentally driven by profit and market logic, it tends to ignore or devalue or just push off the costs of the necessary work of care and social reproduction. And the source is clear. This includes everything: raising kids, caring for elders, maintaining homes, but also emotional labor, community support, all of it. This work, often done unpaid or for very low pay, is absolutely essential for human well-being, for society to even function day to day. Yet it's often invisible in economic calculations, in GDP, in policy decisions. So carelessness captures this systemic disregard. It suggests it's not just an oversight, but maybe a structural feature, something that allows capitalism to accumulate profit by offloading these costs onto the non-market sphere, onto families, onto communities, often onto women, treating care like it's free and infinite.
And how might someone experience that directly?
Well, you might feel it as that constant pressure, that feeling there just aren't enough hours in the day to juggle work, family, personal needs. Or you might see it in the struggles of care workers, child care providers, elder care assistants, who do incredibly important work but often earn very low wages and have precarious conditions. That gap between how crucial the work is and how little it's valued, that's a manifestation of carelessness.
And the text brings up the paradox of the service society. How does that illustrate the contradictions in how we value care in modern economies?
The paradox of the service society, it highlights this real tension in advanced capitalist economies. As our societies become more service-oriented, the actual demand for care services, childcare, elder care, health support, even emotional labor in service jobs, it goes up significantly. We rely on these services more and more. But here's the paradox. Despite this growing societal need, despite how critical the work is, the economic value assigned to this labor often stays stubbornly low. And the workers themselves. They frequently face precarious employment, low pay, lack of benefits, little social recognition. So there's a huge disconnect between societal need and economic valuation. It shows how a market system, geared towards profit, really struggles to properly integrate and reward work that's inherently about human well-being, about relationships. It often pushes care work into this low-status, easily exploited category, even though society depends on it.
So we see care moving from the private sphere, unpaid family work, into the market with paid services. But the source suggests this commodification doesn't automatically fix the problem or address the systemic carelessness. What are the downsides of that shift?
That's a really important nuance. The formalization, the commodification of care. It means activities that used to happen mostly within households, unpaid, often by women, now get provided by paid workers or organizations in the market. And on the surface, that might look like progress, like we're finally valuing care by paying for it. But the text argues it doesn't necessarily lead to better conditions for the care workers. Often these jobs remain low wage, insecure, lacking respect. Think about home health aides or daycare workers. Plus, the very act of turning care into a commodity, something bought and sold, it can potentially strip away some of the relational, empathetic qualities that are so central to what care actually is.
Turning it into just a transaction.
Potentially, yeah. And this shift can also deepen inequalities. People with money can buy high-quality care, while others are left struggling with inadequate public services or relying on already overburdened informal networks. So it can reinforce that systemic carelessness by framing care as just another consumer good, rather than a societal responsibility or a human right. It doesn't fundamentally challenge the undervaluation of the labor itself.
And this is where the critique gets really interesting and global. The source explicitly mentions global care chains, where women, often from the global south, migrate to provide care, labor, childcare, elder care in the global north. This really illuminates how intersectionality plays out, doesn't it? Showing how capitalist demands for care are met through migration, but it leads to complex inequalities, dependencies. It clearly raises that question, who benefits and who is burdened?
Absolutely. Global care chains is such a powerful concept for understanding how this carelessness operates on a world scale. What happens is, as more women in wealthier global north countries enter the formal workforce, the demand for affordable care labor there grows. Someone needs to do the caring work domestically. And this demand is often met by women migrating disproportionately from the global south. They leave their own families, their own communities behind to care for families in wealthier nations.
So there's a double impact.
Exactly. While these migrant workers might find economic opportunities, they often face really precarious working conditions, exploitation, maybe social isolation in the destination country. And at the same time, their departure can create what researchers call care deficits back in their home countries. Their own children, their own elderly relatives are left without their primary caregiver, often looked after by other women grandmothers, older daughters, who themselves might face increased burdens and precarity. It creates this cycle, this chain of dependencies and often exploitation stretching across borders. It vividly shows how capitalist systems leverage global inequalities, gender, race, nationality, class. The benefits enjoyed by some in the North are often directly linked to the burdens and sacrifices of others in the South. It exposes the deeply interconnected and often ethically fraught nature of global social reproduction.
So it really underscores that it's not just about paid versus unpaid work. It's about how entire categories of essential human activity are systematically devalued. That seems fundamental to how the system works, according to this critique.
Precisely. If we step back and look at the big picture, this devaluation of social reproduction is a core argument. The text argues this carelessness isn't some bug in the system. It's a feature. It's a structural characteristic that actually allows capitalism to thrive by externalizing huge costs. By systematically undervaluing things like raising children, caring for elders, maintaining communities, capitalism basically offloads the cost of reproducing the workforce in society onto individuals, families, communities, the state, without properly compensating or recognizing these efforts as economically valuable.
It's like a hidden subsidy.
Exactly. A hidden subsidy for profit generation, built on unseen, often unpaid, labor. And it leaves critical narratives unexamined, right? About who actually bears the burden of keeping human life going, keeping society functioning, when this work isn't properly supported.
And the impact of this devaluation falls unevenly, particularly hitting gender and class relations hard. The source notes that social reproduction isn't just individual, it's about communal efforts. How does highlighting that collective dimension challenge conventional thinking?
That's a crucial point. This devaluation disproportionately harms women and marginalized groups. It reinforces traditional gendered divisions of labor women primarily doing unpaid care or funneled into low-wage care jobs. And this intersects with class. The ability to outsource or buy care is often linked to economic privilege, so it deepens class inequalities too. But emphasizing the collective dimension, as the source does, is key. It pushes back against the idea that care is just a private, individual responsibility, a family matter. It highlights that maintaining life in society requires communal efforts, shared resources, robust public support systems. By framing care as purely private, capitalism can fragment those communal ties, obscure the collective effort involved, and resist demands for societal solutions. Recognizing the collective nature demands we rethink our social contracts to genuinely support the reproduction of life as a shared responsibility.
And the source implies this leads to a broader crisis of care. It makes you wonder what actually happens when a system is designed to undervalue the very activities that sustain it. What does that crisis look like on the ground?
This crisis of care is presented as a direct and likely accelerating consequence of that structural carelessness. When the essential work that sustains us, nurturing kids, caring for the sick and elderly, educating people, maintaining communities, when it's systematically devalued, underfunded, and those doing it are overburdened, the whole social fabric comes under immense strain.
And in real terms?
In real terms, the crisis looks like widespread burnout among caregivers, both paid and unpaid. It looks like declining quality of care in understaffed, underfunded institutions. It looks like inadequate social infrastructure, lack of affordable childcare, crumbling support for disabled people, insufficient elder care options. Ultimately, it threatens human well-being and social cohesion. It forces us to confront the sheer unsustainability of a system that extracts value from these vital activities without reinvesting in them. The long-term implications are huge, potentially undermining not just individual lives, but the stability of society itself. We see it in stressed public services, soaring care costs, the mental health toll on people trying to juggle it all.
Okay, now let's shift gears slightly and explore how these ideas connect with environmental concerns. The source includes that interview with Ariel Saleh, who's a prominent voice in ecofeminism. What does ecofeminism bring to this critique of capitalism? How does it broaden the scope?
Yeah, Soleil's perspective, and ecofeminism more broadly, is fascinating here. What it does is explicitly link the domination of nature with the domination of women and other marginalized groups. Soleil argues in the interview for a fundamental critique of a system capitalism that extracts value from both human labor and natural resources. And it does so without acknowledging their intrinsic value or the labor involved in maintaining and reproducing them, whether that's human care labor or ecological regeneration.
So seeing the connection between exploiting people and exploiting the planet.
Exactly. It's about seeing the deep structural connections. Ecofeminism argues that the same logic of exploitation, the same worldview that devalues women's work, especially care work, that same logic drives the exploitation of the earth, treating ecosystems as just resources to be used up for profit. It challenges that traditional separation we often make between environmental issues and social justice issues, arguing they are fundamentally intertwined under a patriarchal capitalist system. The earth is treated like another externalized resource, just like unpaid care work.
Sully also makes this key distinction between material labor and abstract labor. How does that help us understand why some essential work becomes invisible or devalued, and how does it connect to our ecological crisis?
That distinction is really crucial to the ecofeminist critique. Material labor, for Soleil, refers to direct, embodied work that's closely connected with nature and sustaining life. Think farming, growing food, raising children, tending to ecosystems, traditional crafts, work that directly engages with the physical world, its limits, its cycles. And this work is often performed by women, by indigenous communities, by subsistence farmers. It inherently recognizes the Earth's finite resources and the need for regeneration, like that local farmer's deep knowledge of their specific land. Abstract labor, on the other hand, is the kind of labor valued by capitalism. It's commodified labor, focused on producing things for exchange value, profit, rather than direct use value. It's often detached from the biophysical realities of where things come from or where waste goes.
Like factory work or financial trading.
Exactly. Capitalism tends to prioritize and reward this abstract labor, while systematically devaluing material labor, making the essential work of reproducing life, both human and non-human, invisible, unpaid, or poorly paid. And this creates a deeply distorted economic system, one that fails to account for the true costs of resource depletion, pollution, ecological damage, and fails to value the fundamental care work needed to sustain both people and planet. It's a key reason, from this perspective, why we face simultaneous social and ecological crises.
And the source highlights that ecofeminists oppose the relentless pursuit of economic growth and development, seeing it as inherently destructive. This raises a really profound question, doesn't it? Can true liberation for people and the planet actually be achieved within a system that seems built on commodifying both nature and human life?
That is indeed a central, profound question for ecofeminism. These critiques, like Soleil's, fundamentally challenge that core capitalist imperative: endless economic growth, endless development. They argue this relentless drive for expansion inevitably leads to exploiting natural resources and human labor, often without regard for ecological limits or social well-being. This growth paradigm, they argue, is rooted in a kind of dualistic thinking that separates humanity from nature, mind from body, culture from biology, viewing both nature and marginalized humans as mere resources for exploitation.
So liberation isn't just about fairer distribution within the current system.
From this perspective, no. Because the very logic of the system is seen as the problem. It's inherently extractive and commodifying. True liberation would require a much more radical transformation, changing the underlying values and structures, moving towards models based on reciprocity, care, sustainability, where the well-being of people and the planet comes before profit and accumulation. It suggests liberation isn't just about human freedom and isolation, but about an interconnected flourishing that includes the entire natural world we're part of.
Saleh introduces this powerful concept, embodied materialism. What's that about, and how does it challenge conventional economic thinking?
Embodied materialism is really core to Sully's contribution. It emphasizes that we as human beings are fundamentally part of nature. We're not separate from it, hovering above it. Our bodies, our labor, our health, our well-being, they're all intrinsically linked to the material world, to ecological processes. We are physical beings dependent on a physical planet. This directly challenges that dominant capitalist notion, often implicit, that resources are limitless, that the economy can grow forever, detached from natural constraints. Soleil argues conventional economics fails because it abstracts away this material reality. It focuses on monetary value, on abstract numbers, rather than ecological impacts or the lived, embodied experiences of humans and other beings.
So, recognizing our connection, our dependence.
Exactly. Recognizing our embodied materialism means acknowledging our deep dependency on healthy ecosystems, the finite nature of resources. It fosters a worldview that has to prioritize ecological integrity and actual human needs over just abstract, unchecked economic expansion. It's a reminder that our bodies are made of the earth, and our economies have to respect those fundamental material ties.
The interview also gets into some nuanced details like meta-industrial labor and tacit sustainability science. These seem crucial for understanding Soleil's path forward.
Yes, they are vital for grasping her vision for change. She critiques what she calls meta-industrial labor. This is the kind of scientific and technological work that, instead of fostering genuine sustainability, often ends up serving to justify or enable further resource extraction and environmental damage. It's often detached, she argues, from the direct material consequences of its innovations, and it can reinforce that unsustainable growth model. Think maybe of complex financial instruments based on resource futures rather than direct ecological stewardship.
And the alternative, tacit sustainability science.
Right. In contrast, she highlights tacit sustainability science. This refers to the everyday, often invisible, knowledge and practices of sustainability that are embedded in local communities, in indigenous traditions, in the daily lives of people, particularly women, who directly interact with and care for their environments. This tacit knowledge, knowing when to plant, how to conserve water, how to use resources without depleting them, it's often overlooked by mainstream science and economics. But it holds crucial insights into resilient, truly sustainable ways of living that prioritize long-term well-being for both people and nature. It's about valuing that lived, generational wisdom, not just relying on abstract, top-down technological fixes.
Now, this is a really crucial point for you, the listener, especially if you're interested in different perspectives and real solutions. Soleil actually critiques aspects of the degrowth movement itself, suggesting it might have a gender blind spot. She implies that without a feminist lens, degrowth could unintentionally reinforce existing inequalities. How so?
This critique by Soleil is really important because it pushes for a more thorough, truly liberatory vision of degrowth. The degrowth movement advocates reducing overall consumption and production for ecological sustainability, which sounds good. But Soleil warns that without consciously applying a feminist perspective, the burdens of actually doing that reduction might fall disproportionately on women.
For instance?
Well, for example, if degrowth leads to a greater emphasis on, say, subsistence activities or unpaid household labor, growing your own food, mending clothes, more community-based care, and if society hasn't simultaneously challenged the gender division of labor, who do you think ends up doing most of that extra subsistence work?
Right. Likely women, based on current patterns.
Exactly. So women might find themselves doing even more essential, but still devalued and unrecognized work. Her point is that systemic change needs more than just shrinking the economy. It also needs a fundamental reevaluation and restructuring of gender roles, of power relations, to make sure the benefits of degrowth, like maybe better well-being, less pollution, more free time, are shared equitably, and that all forms of care work, paid or unpaid, are properly valued and shared. It's a call to ensure any big transformation is genuinely liberating for everyone, not just shifting burdens onto already marginalized groups.
Okay, let's move now to the broader concept of justice. The source discusses how these feminist critiques challenge traditional theories of justice. Why is that important, especially if we're thinking about dismantling systemic inequalities?
It's important because, as the source argues, many traditional theories of justice tend to fall short. They often focus on formal equality, everyone being equal before the law, or on abstract principles. But they don't always adequately address the deep systemic inequalities embedded in capitalist societies, especially those linked to gender, race, and class. These traditional approaches might assume a level playing field that doesn't actually exist, or they might focus only on distributing economic goods fairly without questioning the structures that produce unfairness in the first place.
They overlook the underlying power imbalances.
Often, yes. They might overlook how historical and ongoing power dynamics affect who gets access to resources, opportunities, even basic respect and recognition. So a critical question emerges. How can we achieve genuine justice if we don't acknowledge the complex, intersecting nature of power and privilege? How these create very different lived experiences of injustice that go way beyond just economic status. This feminist critique demands we look past purely legal definitions of equality to the messy, lived realities shaped by these deep social structures.
And the source details Nancy Fraser's influential framework here, distinguishing between redistribution and recognition. That sounds like a really helpful way to capture different but connected dimensions of injustice.
Yes, Fraser's framework is a very useful tool in this critique. It's highlighted in the text. She argues that justice isn't just one thing. It requires tackling two distinct but deeply interconnected dimensions. First, there's redistribution. This is about economic justice. It focuses on things like wealth, income, resources. It aims to fix class-based inequalities through, say, fair wages, progressive taxation, social safety nets, material stuff. Second, there's recognition. This is about cultural or social justice. It deals with respect, identity, challenging misrecognition, or the devaluation of certain groups based on gender, race, sexuality, religion, etc.
So challenging stereotypes, valuing diversity.
It's exactly. Promoting cultural understanding, affirming different ways of life. And the crucial point the source emphasizes, drawing on Fraser and others, is that these two aren't separate issues you can fix independently. They are intrinsically linked. Economic disadvantage, a lack of redistribution often goes hand in hand with cultural devaluation, a lack of recognition, and vice versa. Think about how stereotypes about certain groups might limit their job opportunities. So an adequate approach to justice has to address both the material inequalities and the cultural or identity-based injustices that capitalist structures often perpetuate. It encourages a more holistic view of social change.
So the core argument is that achieving justice demands more than just formal legal equality. It requires tackling the underlying social and economic structures that keep generating disadvantage. How does that translate into a vision for a more just society?
Precisely. Formal legal equality is necessary, of course, but it's often insufficient because it can mask those deeper structural inequalities. The feminist critique of justice, as presented here, argues that just having laws saying everyone is equal doesn't dismantle the entrenched systems of power and privilege that systematically disadvantage certain groups. So true justice requires a fundamental transformation of those social and economic structures themselves. That means challenging how work is organized under capitalism, tackling the systemic devaluation of care we talked about, confronting the historical legacies of patriarchy, colonialism, racism that continue to shape disparities today.
So it's about proactive change, not just removing barriers.
Yes, it's about advocating for policies that actively redistribute resources and power, and fostering cultural shifts that genuinely recognize and value all identities and contributions. It's about ensuring not just equal opportunity on paper, but aiming for more equitable outcomes in reality, dismantling the actual mechanisms that reproduce inequality, moving beyond surface-level reforms to address the root causes, building a society where everyone has a genuine chance to thrive.
The book's title itself includes the phrase, capitalism is a way of life. How does thinking about it that way deepen our understanding of labor and gender, taking us beyond just economic models?
That concept, capitalism as a way of life, is really insightful because it highlights how capitalism shapes not just our work lives, but our entire existence, our daily routines, our expectations, maybe even our hopes and dreams. The source uses this to discuss the historical shift from what's called Fordism to post-Fordism, showing how the system evolves but often retains its gendered core.
Can you remind us what Fordism and post-Fordism mean in this context?
Sure. Fordism generally refers to that mid-20th century model of mass production. Relatively stable full-time jobs, often unionized, often in manufacturing, and often supported by what's called the male breadwinner model. That's the traditional setup where the man is the primary earner and the woman is primarily responsible for unpaid care work in the home. Very clear, though unequal, gender roles. Post-Fordism, which emerged later, is characterized by more flexible, often precarious, diversified labor. Think service sector growth, part-time work, short-term contracts, globalization of production, the gig economy.
So less stability, more flexibility.
Yes, but that flexibility isn't always positive for the worker. And the source argues this transition isn't just some neutral economic shift. It's a profound societal change that deeply affects who works, how they work, what kinds of labor are valued. And crucially, while the old male breadwinner model might seem less dominant as more women enter the formal workforce, its underlying gendered assumptions and divisions often just adapt rather than disappear. This can create new forms of gendered inequality. For instance, women might be concentrated in precarious low-paid service jobs while still carrying the main load of unpaid care work at home, the famous double shift. It's a societal blind spot, the source suggests, that helps perpetuate these inequalities by hiding or devaluing vast amounts of essential labor.
And the source spends quite a bit of time on precarizing precarity, precarious work. It emphasizes this goes way beyond just job insecurity. It describes growing instability, exhausting forms of labor, the erosion of social protections across life. This seems like where the impact of these large systems really hits home for many listeners. How does this pervasive precarity affect not just work, but personal lives, social belonging?
Yes, precarizing is a central and deeply impactful theme in the source. And you're right, it describes a much broader condition of insecurity than just having a temporary job. It encompasses the decline of stable, long-term employment, yes, but also the intensification of work doing more with less, constant pressure. It includes the reduction of social safety nets, benefits, pensions, and the increasing vulnerability people feel across different parts of their lives. So precarity shapes not only your job situation, but it profoundly impacts your personal life, your relationships, mental and physical health, even your sense of self, your sense of belonging in society.
Can you give some examples of that broader impact?
Well, imagine living with such constant job insecurity that you can't really plan for the future. You hesitate to take a vacation, maybe even to start a family, because everything feels uncertain. Or the chronic stress of unpredictable hours, low wages, fear of losing your job, how that affects your health, strange relationships. It can limit access to stable housing, decent health care, further education. It undermines your ability to participate fully in community or civic life because you're just exhausted or focused on survival. This pervasive instability can create a deep sense of vulnerability, social exclusion, and maybe even a diminished sense of agency, making it harder to push for change. The source argues this widespread precarity reflects and reinforces unequal power structures within contemporary capitalism, affecting people at a really fundamental level.
And the source also suggests this isn't just a local issue, it's a global phenomenon.
That's right. The source explicitly links precarizing to globalized capitalism. It argues it's not confined to one country or region, but it's a worldwide trend, though it looks different in different places. It's tied to the global movement of capital seeking cheaper labor, the way production and supply chains are organized across borders. So while workers in the global north might experience precarity through deindustrialization, the rise of the gig economy cuts to welfare. Workers in the global south might face it through hyper-exploitative conditions in factories, making goods for global markets, through the massive informal economy with no protections, or through migrating for precarious work elsewhere, like those care chains we discussed. This global view highlights how economic vulnerabilities are interconnected worldwide, often reinforcing historical colonial patterns and exacerbating global inequalities.
The source clearly emphasizes intersectionality throughout this discussion. Why is that specific lens so critical for understanding justice within capitalism, particularly given its global reach?
Intersectionality is absolutely paramount, the source argues, because it forces us to move beyond simplistic categories. It challenges the idea that there's a single universal experience of being a woman or a worker or any other group identity. Instead, it reveals how different aspects of a person's identity, their gender, race, class, sexuality, nationality, ability, age, religion, how these intersect and interact to create unique experiences of both privilege and oppression.
So it's not just adding things up.
No, exactly. The source stresses it's not additive. You can't just say someone experiences sexism plus racism plus classism. Intersectionality shows how these systems of power are interlocking, how they mutually shape each other. So, for example, a working-class black woman's experience of sexism will be shaped by her race and class, and her experience of racism will be shaped by her gender and class. It creates a unique positionality. Without this intersectional lens, the source warns, critical analyses remain incomplete. We fail to see the diverse realities, the specific vulnerabilities created by these overlapping systems. And this is absolutely crucial in a global context where these intersections produce vast differences in life chances, exploitation, and resilience across the world.
And the source explicitly expands the analysis beyond just gender and class, right? Bringing in ethnicity, age, religion, sexual orientation, arguing they form these complex, interwoven systems of oppression, as scholars like Cornelia Klinger put it.
Precisely.
The text makes a point of moving beyond a sometimes limited focus solely on gender and class. It integrates these other crucial dimensions: ethnicity, age, religion, sexual orientation, disability, migration status, and so on. And it argues, drawing on Klinger and others, that these aren't just separate issues, but actively co-create and reinforce what can be understood as interconnected systems of oppression. This means someone's experience within capitalism is shaped by the unique combination of their various social positions. For instance, discrimination based on sexual orientation might intersect with wage gaps related to gender, or barriers related to ethnicity or disability. So the intersectional approach provides a much richer, more accurate picture of how power actually operates in people's lives. It reveals the specific ways disadvantage and privilege are produced by the complex interplay of these different identities, making visible those who are often marginalized even within broader social movements. It gets at the layered complexity of lived experience.
And the text connects these sort of micro-level intersectional experiences to the macro-level global inequalities we were just talking about, arguing that globalized capitalism actually exacerbates these disparities. It really forces the question: who benefits and who is burdened by the way work and life are organized today?
Indeed. The source strongly connects the dots between individual intersectional experiences and the larger patterns of global social inequality. It argues that the global capitalist system, in its drive for profit, actively worsens existing disparities. It creates and reinforces uneven development across the world. It tends to disproportionately burden certain populations with the most exploitative, insecure forms of labor, often women, racialized groups, indigenous peoples, people in the global south, while others, often those in positions of power, concentrated in the global north, accrue disproportionate wealth and benefits. So understanding who truly benefits and who is burdened requires an analysis that looks across local, national, and global scales, one that recognizes how historical legacies of colonialism, patriarchy, and racism continue to shape global economic relationships and power dynamics. This broad interconnected view is essential, the source suggests, if we want to identify real points of leverage for challenging this system, because it shows how the prosperity of some is often deeply linked to the precariousness of others.
Okay, this last section seems to move from critique towards thinking about change. It introduces praxis theories. What are those, and how do they help us understand social transformation?
Praxis theories, yeah. They focus on that dynamic link between theory and praxis. The core idea is that social reality isn't just some abstract system out there or a set of fixed structures imposing themselves on us. Instead, reality is continually being created and recreated through our everyday actions, our interactions, our practices.
So we both shape society and are shaped by it.
Exactly. These theories emphasize that social norms, power relations, economic systems, they aren't just external forces. We internalize them. We reproduce them through our habits and routines. But, and this is crucial, we can also challenge and transform them through our agency, through collective action, through changing our practices. So, understanding social change requires looking at both the objective structures, like laws or economic rules, and the subjective experiences and practices of people living within those structures. It suggests change emerges not just from grand manifestos or revolutions, but also from the accumulated impact of countless everyday acts of resistance, negotiation, and innovation.
And the source brings in Pierre Bourdieu's praxeological perspective. Can you unpack concepts like habitus and field to show how our actions are shaped by structures but can also shape them? This sounds useful for exploring lived gendered experiences too.
Bourdieu's perspective is really helpful here, yes. He uses the concept of habitus to describe the system of ingrained dispositions, tendencies, ways of seeing the world, thinking, acting, that we acquire through our upbringing, our education, our experiences within specific social contexts. It's like a set of deeply embedded, often unconscious, habits and assumptions that guide our actions, shape our preferences, our bodily movements, even our tastes. Then there's the field. This refers to a structured social arena like the economic field, the political field, the art world, even a specific workplace or community group. Each field has its own specific rules, often unwritten, its own forms of capital, economic, social, cultural, symbolic, that people compete for.
So our habitus interacts with the field.
Precisely. Our habitus equips us, or sometimes hinders us, to navigate a particular field. Now, while our habitus is deeply shaped by existing social structures and tends to make us reproduce those structures without even thinking about it, it's not completely deterministic. Individuals, through their agency, can become aware of their habitus. They can challenge the rules of the field. They can develop new practices that might gradually shift the structures over time.
Bourdieu also helps us see how power often operates in unseen ways, through subtle norms, everyday interactions, embodied assumptions, rather than just overt commands. Think about gendered expectations in meetings, for example. Someone's habitus might lead them to speak up or stay silent based on ingrained norms, but conscious shifts in practice within that field can start to change the dynamics, challenging those monolithic gender categories through lived action.
We keep circling back to precarity. The source suggests seeing it not just as an economic condition, but as something that shapes who we are, a mode of subjectivation. That sounds quite profound.
It is a profound insight, yes. The argument is that precarity isn't just about having an insecure job or low income. It's a mode of subjectivation, meaning it deeply influences our identity, our sense of self, our outlook on the world, and even our capacity to act politically. When people live under constant insecurity, facing unstable work, uncertain futures, dwindling social support, it takes a toll. It impacts mental and physical well-being, leading to chronic stress, anxiety, a feeling of powerlessness.
So it shapes your subjectivity, your sense of self?
Yes, this ongoing insecurity can become internalized. It can shape how you see yourself, perhaps as vulnerable, as constantly needing to hustle, as unable to rely on stability. Imagine the mental load of constantly looking for the next gig, never feeling secure enough to plan ahead, feeling too worn out to engage with your community or political issues. It fosters what the source calls exhausting labor and ways of life. It intensifies existing vulnerabilities. And it can potentially limit collective action because immediate survival needs might overshadow longer-term organizing efforts. It affects people at a very deep psychological level.
But, and this feels important, despite those really significant challenges, the source also explores how this shared experience of precarity can actually become a starting point for activism, a basis for resistance. Where does that potential come from?
That's the crucial counterpoint. While precarity can be isolating and draining, the source argues it can also, paradoxically, be a catalyst for political mobilization. The shared experience of insecurity, of vulnerability, of feeling let down by the system can actually foster new forms of solidarity and collective agency. The text mentions the potential for a solidarity of the precarious.
Bringing different groups together.
It's exactly. Bringing together diverse groups who might not have previously seen their struggles as connected temporary workers, migrants, indebted students, artists, gig workers, even formerly middle-class people facing instability. Recognizing their common ground and vulnerability can become a powerful basis for organizing, for demanding change. It involves developing new ways of organizing, maybe outside traditional structures, reclaiming public space, directly challenging the systems that create insecurity. It's about moving beyond just diagnosing the problems to seeing the immense opportunities for rethinking how society is organized, for imagining and fighting for alternatives. It's a call for collective imagination, showing that even from positions of vulnerability, transformative power can emerge when people recognize shared struggles and decide to act together.
Wow. Okay, we have covered a huge amount of ground today, a real deep dive into these feminist critiques of capitalism. We've seen how this perspective really pushes us to look beyond just economics, highlighting how capitalism, viewed this way, is fundamentally a system of power deeply intertwined with gender, class, race, and even our relationship with nature.
Yeah, stepping back, we've explored that profound devaluation of care work, of social reproduction, understanding just how essential these activities are, yet how often they're rendered invisible or uncompensated by the dominant system. We touched on ecofeminism's critical insights, linking the exploitation of nature to the exploitation of human labor, especially women's labor. And we've seen how precarity isn't just a temporary job issue, but a pervasive condition shaping our lives, our identities, our capacity for collective action in contemporary capitalism. These critiques really show how interconnected everything is.
So what does all this mean for you, our listener, as you go about your day? Well, this deep dive hopefully encourages you to start seeing some of those hidden structures in your own life, in the world around you. When you're doing care work, paid or unpaid, for family, for community, or when you notice inequalities and how different people can access resources, opportunities, even just respect. You now have perhaps a richer framework for asking why things might be that way, what underlying dynamics are at play. It equips you to look critically at economic news, at social policies, asking who benefits, who is burdened, what assumptions about gender, race, or care are embedded here.
And that raises a really important question for reflection, doesn't it? How does understanding these interconnected critiques, the devaluation of care, intersectionality, precarity, the links to environmental issues, how does that empower you? How can it help you identify and maybe even challenge inequalities in your own sphere, whether that's at your workplace, in your community group, in your consumption choices, and how you interact with others? It's about recognizing that while our individual lives are profoundly shaped by these big systems, collective imagination, collective action, tangible change are possible. It suggests our personal choices and our political actions are linked, and both can contribute to pushing for a world that genuinely values care, equity, and ecological well-being over just endless accumulation.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, here's a final thought to maybe chew on. If the very foundations of our current economic system might be built, as these critiques suggest, on a kind of carelessness, on the subordination of life, both human and non-human, what could a truly liberating alternative actually look like? And maybe more personally, what role could you play in imagining that alternative and perhaps helping to build it? Even starting small, one interaction, one different choice, one critical conversation at a time.
You know, the source itself, in its concluding remarks, poses a question. Feminist critique of capitalism.
Yeah.
What was gained? What is to be gained?
I think that's a great question to leave with our listeners. Ponder that for yourself. What insights have you gained today from this exploration? And how might that knowledge shape what you believe is still to be gained for yourself, for your community, for a more just and sustainable society? It really frames this as an ongoing process, doesn't it? A journey of critical thinking and potential action. Absolutely. We really invite you to continue your own deep dive into these crucial topics. Explore the concepts we've talked about. Maybe look up some of the scholars mentioned like Federici, Salé, Fraser, Bourdieu. Keep asking those critical questions about the world around you.
Your engagement, your thinking, it's all vital. Every conversation sparked, every new insight gained contributes to a broader understanding. And maybe, just maybe, moves us a little closer to a future where knowledge isn't just collected, but actively used for collective liberation and well-being. This knowledge is a tool, really. A tool for seeing your city differently, and potentially for helping to change it.
It's been a really insightful deep dive, I think. This document provides such a vital framework, especially for projects like the Feminist Park Project that are trying to build something fundamentally different. It shows just how interlinked urban design and social justice are.
It really does. But it also shows the scale of the challenge, right? It requires sustained effort, real commitment, and a genuine willingness to shift power dynamics in how cities get made and managed.
Definitely. It makes you think about how we ensure those voices, the ones that have been excluded, are actually heard and centered.
There's another quote from Sarah Ahmed in the handbook that feels relevant here.
Go on.
She says, "If you have to shout to be heard, you are heard as shouting."
That's powerful.
It makes you ponder, doesn't it? How can the design of public space itself work differently? How can it amplify the voices of those who've been historically silenced, ensuring their needs are met without them having to shout just to be noticed?
How can design itself listen? That's a really provocative thought to end on.
A lot to think about.
Indeed. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.